Hi, and welcome to episode 36 of Peace Matters, a podcast on contemporary geopolitics and international relations. My name is George Ljoka. I'm a project assistant at the International Institute for Peace. In today's episode, we will discuss Bosnia and Herzegovina in 30 years after the Dayton Peace Accords were first signed, what that means for the country nowadays, specifically talking about the recent elections in Republika Srpska. We will examine this through the international lens, that is, through the positions of the United States, the EU, Russia, and the neighboring states. What that means for the country's governance and stability and its future. I will be having this conversation alongside two very special guests. Ferenc Nemeth, he is a PhD student at the Corvinus University in Budapest. He is an expert in the Western Balkans region. I will also be joined with Denis Miskic. He's also a project assistant at the International Institute for Peace, and he is a freelance journalist who writes specifically on this region. This episode is in cooperation with Political Capital, which is sponsored by the Open Society Foundation's Western Balkans. Hope you enjoyed the episode. First and foremost, thank you both for joining us. Ferenc, Denis, it's a pleasure to be here with you, specifically commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords. We felt as if it was fitting for us to sort of do a podcast episode on Bosnia and Herzegovina, specifically regarding the recent elections that were held in Republika Srpska. I want to jump straight into it. Denis, we saw very low turnout in Republika Srpska. I believe only 35.8% of voter turnout, those that were eligible to vote, ended up going to vote for still the same party. However, the former president, Dodik, is no longer president. Is there a shift in the public perception of Republika Srpska and sort of its governance? And overall, how is this felt in Bosnia?
Thank you. And not only did we see low turnout, we also saw, which was confirmed by Transparency International, some hints of manipulation, vote fraud in at least 40 polling stations. But what is interesting with this election is that this newly elected president, Siniša Karan, is a person that, if you've asked around in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Republika Srpska, is someone who was barely known before to the wider public.
He was just a minister, I believe, right?
He was just a minister, yes.
Yes.
And even on the election posters, you always had Dodik as kind of a shadow behind him. When they declared their campaign win, what he said was that they, whoever they are in quotation marks, tried to get rid of Dodik. Now they have two Dodiks. And the first official state visit they had was with Orban, where Dodik was kind of leading the conversation. So I would say that we still have the same status quo.
Yeah, and Dodik, from my understanding, was banned from politics entirely. And during the acceptance speech of the current president, Dodik appeared and he said, well, you cannot necessarily get rid of me. Now you not only have one Dodik, but now you have two, going back to what you were saying. Going back to my initial question again, is the public sentiment changing? This is a leadership change, but the party remains the same. Is there a growing sentiment amongst the general public, and how is civil society reacting?
So this 6-year ban that you were talking about for Dodik for not respecting the constitution does not apply to his position as president of the SNSD party. So in this function, he will still be very much active. From the first few days after this election, we can tell that he's going to be still very much active. And the question if public sentiment is going to change, well, no.
So overall, I want to go to the federation itself and how it's reacted to the elections. Is there also the same basically expectation as if Dodik were to win?
I think so, yes. I've heard this very fitting analogy, I think. It's very much the same thing over and over again. And talking about 30 years after Dayton in Bosnia, there was this one expert talking about the situation for the past more or less 20 years in Bosnia. It has felt like this movie Groundhog Day, where you wake up in the same reality over and over again, but actually it is, you wake up in this new reality, but actually it is the same thing over and over again. So this is also what's been happening in Bosnia. I mean, Dodik has been on the scene for ever since Bosnia has been around. And in the last 20 years, we've seen this very hard shift to this nationalist shift. And even the reactions, it's been going back and forth, and it's basically the same thing.
And going back to the peace accords that were signed in Dayton, Ferenc, now I will jump to you. I'm very interested to hear. There is a duality or a polarization, if you will, between local ownership, so Bosnians themselves wanting to handle their own business, for lack of better words, and international supervision. Could you speak on how that is developing as
sure.
of late?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a vicious circle, right? I mean, I get the understanding, and I actually support the understanding that local ownership is pretty much needed in Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially if we take into consideration that Dayton was signed 30 years ago, exactly 30 years ago. And this, let's say, like desire for international actors is not new at all. The question is whether you have a political leadership, and I intentionally don't use the word elite, but a political leadership inside of Bosnia and Herzegovina that would be capable of handling their own business in a political mature way that is against ethno-politicization of the smallest of issues. If you ask me, I don't think there is political maturity, neither willingness from local elites in Bosnia and Herzegovina to act in that way. So that leaves internationals remaining in Bosnia and Herzegovina, meaning the political side of that as well as the military component as well too.
Could you speak on the willingness of the international actors nowadays? I mean, you see with the recent elections, Republika Srpska, you even see with this growing sentiment of EU fatigue, you also see it with the US sort of lifting sanctions on Dodik himself. I'm curious to kind of get a better glimpse into how the international community is. What is their stance to Bosnia and Herzegovina as of late?
The international community, or let me just be more specific, the western part of the international community is pretty much divided. Or as shall I say, there is no Bosnia and Herzegovina policy that would be very clear to me inside of the EU, or not with regards to the EU and the USA either. When it comes to the EU and the USA, I would say that the basic principles of territorial integrity, the protection of territorial integrity is still in place, also even under the Trump administration. But how Trump deals with potential threats to territorial integrity has changed. I'm not saying that it supports local actors that may undermine the Dayton spirit or the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but there is a clear shift in how the US is handling foreign policy, and that has an impact on Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. Just to give you an example, instead of clearly and loudly advocating for peace, stability, and once again, territorial integrity being the word of the day. This US administration prefers closed-door meetings, closed-door deals that are pretty much transactional. And this is something that I would say the leadership in Bosnia and Herzegovina needs to learn how to lobby for their interest, if we can obviously identify Bosnian interest at this point, and how to deal with an American administration that is pretty much driven many times by emotions and transactional deals. And for certain actors in Bosnia and Herzegovina, case in point Dodik and lifting sanctions on Dodik and his family and business circle, it worked, but others should also learn the know-how on dealing with this kind of administration. And obviously, when it comes to the EU, there is a clear desire, and this is also not a new desire, to have the EU handle all the issues that may pop up in the Western Balkans. And the EU is also very much divided on how to enlarge. There is an understanding since a few years that enlargement should be a priority, but to how to enlarge is still a big question mark. And obviously, when it comes to Bosnia specifically, there are countries, case in point Hungary, and I shall mention Croatia as well, that may undermine a more or less unified position vis-à-vis Bosnia and Herzegovina and the EU.
And jumping to you, Dennis, why would you say that the European Union at the moment is struggling to sway not only the political sentiment amongst all of Bosnians, but more specifically the political elite?
Just touching upon what you just mentioned very, very well, is I think we need to ask the question, who is the EU? So is it speaking with one voice, or is it different actors with different interests? And when we're talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, we need to talk about inside the EU, what Croatia and what Hungary, what their interests are. In terms of the political elites in Bosnia, I'm not very sure in what direction it is going. I was just in Brussels for a discussion on EU enlargement, where one of the experts there said no one really knows what to do with Bosnia when we're talking about enlargement. And I think this is very fitting, because we see discussions on constitutional reform in Bosnia to bring the country forward 30 years after Dayton. This is not really leading anywhere. Most of the decisions locally are blocked in the parliament. Nothing is really moving forward. And just like the prospects of joining the EU, what the then EU ambassador said was, this is not something that the politicians have earned with reforms. This is a gift to the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, just so that they still don't lose the hope of the EU. And I do believe that this normative power that the EU has is still shining very brightly in most parts of Bosnia. But the question I've been asking myself lately is, how long will this be able to go on for?
I mean, the fact that Bosnia has received candidate status, if I'm not mistaken, 2 years ago, and virtually nothing significant has taken place since that period.
No cluster have been opened, correct?
There was the reform agenda has been sent to the Commission, and it's been awaiting now. So what's...
But still, I mean, in the grand scheme of life, Bosnia is still in a very early stages of EU accession. And like I mentioned, and I agree with you, Dennis, that granting candidate status to Bosnia can be perceived as a gift. I always say that it's a check blanco, so it's a blank check. It was a big political sign for local politicians that we still have hope, or we still hope that you can do the right thing internally. But at the end of the day, the EU, the European Commission, or whoever member states, they cannot really force and enforce local actors to implement the reforms that is desired by the EU. So once again, we come back to the local ownership problem, is that without responsible politicians, there is going to be no EU integration moving forward.
And I'm sorry to cut into your moderation, but if I can just add on this as well. I mean, the best case probably would be draft up a new, like in this real utopian world, is we draft up a new constitution that actually works, that does not enable political blockades, like a tabula rasa, and then we start from new. But this will not work. I mean, Bosnians have been living in this reality for 30 years now. Parts of the society are polarized. And the problem is that people are losing this sense of a unified Bosnian state or country. If you go to Banja Luka now, people will treat news from Sarajevo as foreign news. If you open the television services webpage of the Republika Srpska, news from Sarajevo are under the segment of foreign policy, foreign news.
To pick up on that, would you say that the Dayton Agreement further fed the division? Because, I mean, initially it was signed so that they could make all the ethnicities sort of live in harmony. That was the principle. But then again, it divided the region, the country itself, into ethnic divisions.
I mean, the Dayton Agreement was a means to end the war. This is something that everyone there said. The main goal is to end the war, and Holbrooke's book, where he writes about it, was to end a war. And it left the country with a weak central government. So this division was something that was probably necessary to stop the fighting. And this is also something that Holbrooke said himself, there should have been a point, and he said that this point should have been 10 years after signing the Dayton Agreement, where new negotiations open up again as to where to go with the country, especially with the constitution, with Annex 4 of the Dayton Agreement. This didn't happen so far.
Do you have any comments on that? I was reading a paper of yours that is yet to be published regarding positive and negative peace. And from what I remember, you were saying that sort of the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords was mostly leaning into negative peace, meaning it wanted to end the war immediately. It was not far-sighted, it was short-sighted. It just wanted to end the casualties. But wouldn't you say that that would be a flaw of the peace accords themselves for them not having long-term goals?
I mean, at that period of time, the ultimate goal was to end hostilities. And it succeeded, and the Dayton Peace Accord still succeeds after 30 years in doing so. The problem is, and this is where this Galtung's theory of positive peace comes up, is that negative peace, meaning the lack of hostilities or active armed conflict, is not enough to achieve social, political, and economic growth and development. What you need for that is an environment that provides social justice and the means to achieve the lack of discriminatory nature or a lack of any forms of discrimination. Obviously, this is very idealistic to think about a country or an environment lack of any social injustices, but my point in this upcoming publication by Political Capital is that the institutions itself in Bosnia and Herzegovina must be reimagined or strengthened. There have been so many challenges against these institutions. Local politicians with their secessionist claims over the past 10 years or so have been pushing that proverbial envelope to see whether they can achieve their own goals within the system or whether they can basically break down the system as such. In that sense, they haven't succeeded, which is a good thing. It shows that there is enough flexibility and enough endurance in the institutions as such. Once again, with the strong support of the international community. And I would perceive 2025 as one of the greatest challenges to the legal institutional framework of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in some sense, and this might be a hot take, I think after this crisis with regards to Dodik, some institutions in Bosnia and Herzegovina actually have gotten stronger, especially the Constitutional Court, the Bosnian court system, and the Central Election Committee proved that under such pressure, they could still fulfill their mandates or job pretty much properly. The question is, who is going to be the next one to try to push the limits, and whether the institutions itself in its current state will be able to fight back. That's the question, or let's say that's the biggest thing that I'm going to look forward in the next, let's say, 12 months to come.
That was a situation where Dodik appeared in court, in front of a court that he didn't recognize, and he paid off. The sentencing that he received was a 1-year prison fine and 6 years ban of having a political function, and he paid off the prison fine with, I think, a bit more than 18,000 euros. So again, he paid off a fine to a legal system that he doesn't respect or recognize. So this, I would agree, is something to acknowledge as well. Yeah.
So in this sense, I would say that we don't have the political willingness from local politicians to have a Dayton 2.0, if you will. But at this point, I don't think we need a complete redo on the Dayton system, because what this year showed to me is that it can still be, we can still maneuver around the system in a way that it can provide, let's say, like justice. What we only need is a few tweaks here, now and then.
Very interestingly, Dodik has had very good relations with Orban. And I'm very curious to sort of hear your insights as to how Hungary's relationship with Dodik is going to impact the dynamics within Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Would you like to? I'm just joking. So listen. This is not a new development. That it has been years since Orban basically put all of his proverbial eggs to Dodik's basket. Although let's not imagine this metaphor in real life. Relations between Sarajevo and Budapest are basically non-existent at this point. Budapest only focuses on Banja Luka, especially when it comes to high-level politics and major economic investments coming from Hungary to Republika Srpska. This is not the Balkan policy, or this is not the Bosnia policy that I envision for Hungary, especially not taking into consideration the number of Hungarian soldiers or Hungarian personnel at EUFOR or in its predecessor in the NATO missions. So in a sense that I feel like we have a bit of a paradox with Hungary's involvement in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In one way, I would argue that it can still provide stability through its involvement in EUFOR, but on the other way, especially with regards to the ties between Orban and Dodik, it creates insecurities not only in Republika Srpska, or actually it creates securities in Republika Srpska, but insecurities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I don't know moving forward how this can be somehow managed or mitigated. I feel like at this point, Orban appreciates its relations to Dodik very much, and no matter what kind of position Dodik is going to have in the future, Orban is still going to maintain close personal ties to Dodik. I've heard many times from different sources, from Hungarian and sources from Bosnia as well, is that the chemistry works very well between the two leaders. Obviously, I haven't done any research on chemistries between politicians or what chemistry means in political science, but that seems to be, let's say, the glue that binds those leaders together, in addition to sharing the same ideology, especially based on blaming the West, namely the EU, for everything that can be experienced nowadays in the world. So when it comes to, let's say, internal dynamics in Bosnia and Herzegovina vis-a-vis Hungary, I don't see any, let's say, maneuvering space anymore for Hungary to have its relations to Sarajevo repaired. I think Orban made this conscious decision a few years ago that it will only focus on Banja Luka in terms of politics and in terms of economic investments, and I don't see any rays of hope in changing that position anytime soon.
Dennis, do you have any comments yourself?
Yeah, I mean, on the recent visit, we saw another announcement for new investments in Banja Luka. I think it was for farmers or agriculture. Yep. And apart on this level, we also, what they both have in common is that they are also try to keep very good ties with Putin and Russia. And then Orban traveled to Moscow today to meet Putin. And parallel to Hungary, I would also just like to add that Croatia, in the past few years, more and more has risen as kind of a beneficiary of secessionism, Serb secessionism on the one side, but also the efforts of the Croat Democratic Union of Bosnia and Herzegovina, HDZ BiH, and its leader Dragan Čović, who is a very good friend of Dodik's, we would say a house friend, and has been calling for something like a third entity, the Herceg Bosna in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So when we talk about who will be next to push the boundaries, to plunge this country into crisis or to test the limits, this is something to keep an eye on as well.
And I guess going to Russia's stance perhaps on the dynamics within Bosnia and Herzegovina, I mean, given the war in Ukraine, how do you think that those intersect with one another, Terence?
I am happy that Denis brought up Putin or Putin's Russia with regards to Hungary, because I think this is the main difference between Hungary and Russia. Very much surprisingly is that Russia doesn't really give any financial incentives or benefits or any economic investments to the country, let alone to Dodik or Republika Srpska, whereas Hungary seems to have enough resources somehow from Hungarian taxpayers' money to finance investments in Republika Srpska. So my point is that when it comes to Russia's role in Bosnia and Herzegovina in general, handshakes don't really give you any incentives. They don't pay your bills. It doesn't pay Dodik's debt coming up early next year. But on the other hand, it is Russia's interest to keep Bosnia as messy as possible because it's a good, let's say, platform or a good country to if needed, to divert attention from the war in Ukraine, to divert Western attention or maybe put a wedge between Western support. So if something happens in Bosnia and Herzegovina, obviously that will cause shockwaves in the European Union, or let's say in Europe or in the transatlantic world. And that might be very much beneficial for Russia, because for those 2 or 3 seconds, while Bosnia and Herzegovina would be in the spotlight, nobody would think about what is going on at those 3-second periods in Ukraine. So in this sense, I think without giving any major financial contributions to Dodik or to Republika Srpska, Russia can still, without spending a single dime, support its own goal in the Balkans, especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, is to divert attention from Ukraine.
And has the European Union directly responded to these face-to-face diplomacies, if you will, between the Bosnian leader and also Russia? Directly, no?
And that's the problem. I mean, with regards to Dodik and Putin, I haven't seen any statements coming from the EU side. But when it comes to, and I'm not going to hijack the conversation, when it comes to Vučić going to Moscow and then to Beijing, despite the warnings by European institutions that it won't be taken lightly, I haven't seen any, let's say, like backlash, political backlash, coming from the EU side that would be directed at Vučić. And this is, let's say, once again, this kind of vicious circle that we now live in. There are politicians inside of the EU who likes to travel to Moscow, case in point Orbán and Slovakia's Fico, and once they come back, the EU doesn't really have the proper toolkit to say that next time don't do it because there are going to be major consequences. So how can the EU say that certain politicians from the Balkans, let it be Bosnia or Serbia, cannot do this or that in a situation when their own EU leaders are doing the same behavior and getting away with it?
And going to Serbia now, we mentioned Croatia a little bit, we mentioned Russia, we mentioned the US, Europe. How is Serbia positioning itself in terms of with its relations to Bosnia and Herzegovina, specifically after the elections of Republika Srpska?
Well, I think Vučić has always been trying to keep kind of publicly a safe distance to Dodik, but it is clear that they are in support of whatever they've been trying to do. But if I can go one step back again and also just mention one thing on Russia's influence, Serbia and Bosnia, I mean, Russia is very much cognizant of the fact that the Western Balkans lie in kind of the heart of the European Union, if you will. And so it is no surprise that when the Republika Srpska commemorates their unconstitutional statehood day on the 9th of January, we see this Russian biker gang, the Night Wolves, officials from Russia present, training grounds in Serbia and in Bosnia. So this malign influence has been very much active, and not only in these past few years with crises. And if I remember correctly, when in 2022, Dodik also announced more secessionist steps, and a big Bosnian crisis was once again announced. It was also the Russian ambassador that was very much active, publicly at least, making speeches and threats. And when we talk about Serbia and Bosnia, one thing I remember is I visited Belgrade in April for when Vučić had his big support protest amid the student protests against him. What I noticed was that they were very much propagating this sense of a greater Serbia. So you had these big speakers around the city where they would have songs blaring where the Republika Srpska was the Holy Land, just as Kosovo was. And some of the speakers were also like guests from Republika Srpska, and they were announced as our brothers and sisters from Republika Srpska. So I think it is very clear where they stand.
Vučić likes to create drama and create instabilities all around Serbia and inside Serbia as well. But Vučić, what really likes is to resolve those situations. And I feel like with Dodik, he cannot really do that anymore. I mean, in the past, after a meeting or two with Dodik, he could somehow normalize once again the situation or the political stances. But in the past few years, it seems that there is a wedge between Dodik and Vučić. Or shall I say, Dodik wants to have his own agency outside of Vučić. And I don't think the Serbian president likes this situation. And once again, I think at this point, Vučić has a much bigger, fish to fry back at home with regards to the student protests, with regards to the fate of Nice and other economic problems, and has limited efforts nor energy to deal with Republika Srpska, let alone with Dodik.
2 weeks ago, I attended the Belgrade Security Conference, and I was hearing actually Serbs basically their experience with going outside of their bubble and sort of protesting and standing up against their dissatisfactions with the government. And it got me thinking, what about the civil society in Bosnia and Herzegovina? I mean, this has been the dynamics between the two polarizing sides, if you will, the Federation and Republika Srpska, that has grown dissatisfaction, I presume, amongst the general public, specifically the youth. Why is the response so different from both countries? I'm asking the both of you now.
I've heard this question multiple times before, especially with this comparison with Serbia. So the canopy in Novi Sad collapsed and massive protests turned up. And in Bosnia, we had floods in Jablanica where 19 people died. We had a fire at a pensioner home in Tuzla just a month ago. And if you follow the news and if you talk to people, there is a new political scandal coming up. There was just a femicide in Mostar a week ago. And it seems like it is just this vicious cycle repeating over and over again, but no public outrage. Why is that so? And the best answer that I could come up with is that, well, who should they turn to? So if you have a problem with the educational system or in school, this is a matter that is discussed on the cantonal level in the federation. So you protest in front of the Ministry of Education in your canton. If people in Banja Luka are unhappy with something in Republika Srpska, they will protest in Banja Luka, and we saw protests in Banja Luka a few years ago. And then if people are unhappy with something in the federation, they will protest in Tuzla or in Sarajevo. So it is very decentralized, and this doesn't leave any space for a big movement to grow out of it. However, and also this, if you talk to people, what they will often say is they would just like some time to breathe through again, like some fresh wind. Not the fresh wind that Dodik was in the beginning, but a real kind of fresh wind with new perspective and a new drive. On the other side, I think it is a sign of resilience that there even is something like a Bosnian civil society, that people are still turning up. We have new activist movements. You probably know, like the Karton Revolucija. And this sign of resilience shows us that there is something keeping this together.
Ferenc?
It's a tough position to be in. I mean, let's say the financial aspects of civil society is not that much engaging for a lot of people to join forces, first and foremost. But also, I can only agree with you. And another example I can bring, let's say, as a positive example, is North Macedonia's example, with regards to how the synergies between Serbia and North Macedonia impacted, let's say, the outrage that followed the Kočani disco fire in last year in North Macedonia. So it can definitely be about decentralization or centralization of the state, how the state functions itself. But let me tell you from experience, I think even in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a lot of people, including civil society and politicians alike, are closely following what is going on in Serbia, how durable the protests are, and whether those protests can actually enhance real changes to the system. If yes, that, in my understanding, that will trigger, let's say, this hopefully positive trajectory for the entire region. And if not, let me not finish that sentence, ...
And so we're talking about the civil society's reaction, but also I think we should consider even the opposition in Republika Srpska scored pretty high compared to other years. So there is still this growing sentiment, even amongst the opposition themselves, or rather the general public, in actually changing the system, if you will. Wouldn't you agree, Dennis?
Well, when we talk about the opposition in Republika Srpska, I think it is also important to mention that they are not the complete opposite of Dodik. There's still politicians that very much identify with Republika Srpska, and what they are unhappy with is the way that Dodik has chosen to move forward. But I think it will be interesting to follow closely what they're doing, how they're progressing, and what this will mean for next year's general elections in Bosnia. But it is also, if you will, kind of a paradoxical situation today that this oppositional party, the SDS, that has its roots in the 1990s with Karadzic, is today a political party which Bosniaks in Sarajevo are hoping will win at the elections. I just wanted to also comment on that.
As an expert, but also as an outsider, or let's say acknowledging that I'm still an outsider, I can sense with regards to, let's say, the society of Erez, but that is also true to Bosnia and Herzegovina in general, kind of a paradoxical situation. The first is that there is a growing dissatisfaction with politics, that's for sure, reflected on by the fact that Siniša Karani only won by a small margin. On the other hand, there is also a growing political apathy. So people don't go to the voting stations, reflected by the fact that only 35% or so of eligible citizens voted for the Erez presidential elections. And obviously one can argue that those were extraordinary elections. Next year, when there are going to be general elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the turnout will be higher. But still, I feel like there is this paradox that there are so many dissatisfactions with how politicians are running the state, or let's just focus on Republika Srpska, how is the economic situation is going, it's not going well, how people are leaving the country in a very fast and speedy manner, but also they are just sick and tired of this political leadership that now is basically taking control of the entire political sphere. So I feel like these two tendencies that might seem a bit paradoxical go hand in hand, and it will be detrimental to see if these tendencies are going to eventually reach their peak, possibly at next year's elections. Because what I can also see is that the society itself is very much used and abused by politicians, and I do think that the boiling point will soon arrive.
And also, just a few more remarks on this, and also the civil society is also, I mean, it is very hard, I think, today to be member of the civil society, to be any type of activist, especially in the Republika Srpska. I mean, Dodik has been known to give public speeches where he names specific activists, experts, people, journalists, and puts a target on them.
By name.
By name, yes.
During his speeches, he just says this person.
This guy hates the Republika Srpska and what we stand for. And this is obviously a problem and drives a lot of people away. So they've been kind of draining all of the political life out of the air. And if you walk around Banja Luka today, you also have, I mean, at most of the kiosk stands, you will only be able to buy Belgrade propaganda newspapers. And about the low voter turnouts, this could be one possible explanation for this, or also that it was in as you said, an extraordinary election. We will see what happens next year. What I found interesting was looking at some of the news reporting right after the elections at the polling stations. What a lot of people said. I mean, obviously, no one wanted to know. No one was asking directly who they were voting for, but what they were voting for. And a lot of the people mentioned that they just were voting for change. And who is this change? Well, whoever wants us to do a bit better. So I think that people are very much feeling that these are not very good times, and that Dodik could be responsible for the situation that they're in today. And I mean, sorry to interrupt you again. You've mentioned the lifting of the U.S. sanctions. He has spent tens of millions of euros on lobbying in the U.S. to get these sanctions lifted over his fake embassies or predstavništvo in Moscow and in Vienna. And on the other side, people in Banja Luka are struggling to get through the month.
Could you explain exactly what do you mean by fake embassies?
Well, I mean, as the Republika Srpska is an entity inside of the country, they do not have an embassy somewhere in the outside. I mean, their embassy is the Bosnian embassy here, and they are registered like private companies, but act like an embassy. So they are doing political work, lobbying, advocacy, and also, in this case, lobbying.
And you also mentioned Vienna as one of the places where apparently these fake embassies work at. Could you speak if Austria is playing any role in Bosnia and Herzegovina overall as of late?
Well, it is always mentioned that Austria is a big economic factor in Bosnia and Herzegovina overall. Whether they perceive their lobbying at all, or if in any way, I'm not very sure. But there are also the obvious historical and cultural ties to Bosnia and Herzegovina in overall. But we need to keep in mind that the Western Balkans department in the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs still is also very small. So I think they're very limited in what they could do. But the new Austrian minister, Beate Meinl-Reisinger, was, together with the German foreign minister, they were the first people in the EU to impose sanctions on Dodik. So I think that set a very important signal right at the beginning.
If there's anything that, and this will be the last question, if there's anything that I've learned through this conversation is if institutions can only act if there is political will amongst the local community, but you take the international institutions out of the equation, what happens next? In terms of Bosnia's stability, in terms of Bosnia's future governance, where would Bosnia fall under? This is a question to the both of you guys.
I feel like because of the problems that basically are created and triggered by the political leaders inside of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the country itself is not ready, even 30 years after Dayton, is to the departure of the international actors. Let it be EU4, the High Representative Office, or let's say the international judges from the Constitutional Court. With that said, let's not forget that internationals are the best scapegoats for local politicians. So in a sense, I don't really think that local politicians that are the loudest with regards to the departure or the need for internationals to depart from Bosnia and Herzegovina really want internationals to leave, if you catch my drift, because then who should you blame for your mistakes or your inability or unwillingness to resolve your own country's problems? It's so easy to blame internationals or foreign actors, but in the absence of those, you need to take political responsibility, as this is something 30 years forwards that local politicians are still trying to avoid.
Dennis?
As you said, Bosnia and Herzegovina is not ready. So, and in conversations you often hear, you cannot have a country that still needs oversight from something like a high representative join the European Union. And if we take the international institutions, the internationals out of the equation, I can only leave with a sense of optimism, because I feel like this is all I've got, and I can only hope for that there will be some people that step up and actually do the work that is necessary. There is some of my Bosnian friends said if everyone would just do what they're supposed to do, we would do a lot better than we're doing right now. And one concrete thing that could be done is work at the implementation of the judgments from the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So maybe I would leave with that. Just do the work you're supposed to do.
Yeah, but is it the young people's responsibility? I mean, this same question could be applied in the entirety of the region. Is it necessarily our place to do the change when in fact we ourselves have not directly affected what's wrong with our region?
Well, I think there's this over-focus on the young people, and it's always, okay, what are the young people doing? We need to support the young people everywhere. We've talked about this before. Starting here, we see this growing trend of more nationalist sentiment and conservatism in young people. So I would not put all my eggs in that basket. I would say that it is everyone's responsibility across the board.
Peace matters. Thank you guys so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. It feels very nice to talk about this specifically in commemoration to the 30th anniversary of Dayton. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sticking to the very end. It's very much so appreciated. Please keep an eye out for upcoming events from both the IIP and Political Capital, and also the upcoming publication by Ferenc that will be published in Political Capital. Leave a like, subscribe, share around with those that would be interested, and until the next one, thank you.